The little black girl warned the biker someone dragged a child into a restricted chamber beneath the Foundry. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started. It was a cool evening, the kind where the wind blew gently through the trees, making the leaves dance in the moonlight. A quiet night, or so it seemed at first. But this night was far from ordinary. Outside a small, run-down biker bar on the edge of town, a sudden scream sliced through the air. A little black girl, no older than 10, was running toward the bar, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The bikers inside the bar paused, their laughter and chatter dying in an instant. The girl's face was twisted with fear, her eyes wide with panic. She skidded to a stop in front of a tall, muscular biker, grabbing his leather vest with trembling hands. "Please, you have to help me," she gasped. "They took my brother. They dragged him into the chamber under the Foundry." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The biker, a weathered man named Jack, looked down at her with a furrowed brow, his heart skipping a beat. He had seen his fair share of trouble, but this was different. Without a second thought, Jack motioned to his brothers. "Get ready," he barked, his voice low but commanding. The other bikers stood up, some looking confused, others nodding with understanding. They were used to dealing with dangerous situations, but this was something new. The girl, still holding on to Jack's vest, explained that her brother, Jamal, had been playing near the Foundry when a group of men grabbed him and pulled him into the restricted area beneath the building. She had tried to scream for help, but they threatened her, warning her to stay away. Her small hands were shaking as she described the dark, narrow passage leading to the chamber below. Jack's mind raced. The Foundry had been abandoned for years, but there were rumors. Strange things happening in the shadows. No one in town dared go near it. And now, someone had taken a child. A quick glance between Jack and his crew said it all. They were going to find this kid, no matter what. Jack knelt down to the girl's level, his tone soft but firm. "Where exactly is it?" She pointed toward the old, rusted building in the distance, the flickering light from the street lamp barely illuminating its eerie silhouette. "The chamber," she whispered, "was beneath the Foundry, hidden away from sight." Without another word, Jack and his crew, all clad in their leather jackets and heavy boots, mounted their bikes. The engines roared to life, breaking the silence of the night. The girl clung to Jack's side, her small body shivering in fear. The bikers revved their engines, preparing for the ride of their lives. They were used to battles on the road, but tonight, they were riding for something bigger, a child's life. As they sped down the dark road toward the Foundry, the air thick with tension, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading straight into a trap. But there was no turning back now. The kid was counting on them. The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the night as Jack and his crew sped down the road, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The Foundry loomed in the distance, a towering, decaying structure that seemed to sigh under the weight of its own history. Abandoned for years, it was now nothing more than a forgotten relic of the past, a place that whispered of danger and secrets buried deep beneath the surface. As they approached the rusted gates, the air grew thick with tension. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reminding him of the promise he had made years ago. He couldn't fail this little girl. Not now. Not after everything her father had done for him. The bikers slowed down as they reached the entrance. The gates of the Foundry creaked in protest as they pushed open, the rusted hinges groaning like the whispers of ghosts long gone. The scene before them was chilling. Overgrown weeds sprawled across the cracked pavement, and broken windows stared back at them like empty eyes. It was a place that had been abandoned by time, and people alike, but now it held the very real threat of danger. Jack looked back at the girl, still clinging to his side, her small hands gripping his leather vest. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. She had already been through more than anyone her age should have to endure. He could feel her trembling against him, and a surge of protectiveness rushed through him. "Stay close," he said softly, though he knew there was no need to say it. She wasn't going anywhere without him. The group of bikers moved cautiously, scanning every shadow, every corner. The air felt heavier here, the silence suffocating. They reached the edge of the Foundry's main building, where a series of dark stairs led down into the ground below. This was it. The entrance to the chamber where the girl had said her brother was being held. Jack took a deep breath, his senses on high alert. "We stick together," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one gets left behind." One by one, the bikers followed him down the narrow, spiraling stairs. The air grew colder as they descended, the smell of rust and decay filling their nostrils. At the bottom, the door to the chamber stood ominously in front of them. It was made of thick, iron bars, locked tight with chains and a heavy padlock. Jack stepped forward and examined the lock. "This won't be easy," he muttered under his breath, pulling out his tools. As he worked on the lock, his mind raced. What was going on here? Who were these people who had taken the girl's brother? And why? The sound of the lock clicking open broke his thoughts. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the heavy iron scraping against the floor. A musty, damp smell hit them, followed by the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. The chamber beyond was vast, with high, crumbling walls and shadows stretching across the floor. Jack's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light. It was clear this place had been used for something far darker than any innocent purpose. The walls were lined with strange markings, and in the corner of the room, Jack could make out the faintest outline of a figure. His heart skipped a beat. Jamal. The sound of the boy's name echoed in the hollow chamber, but there was no answer. Jack's pulse quickened. He motioned for the others to spread out and search the room. Every corner, every shadow could be hiding something, or someone. The tension in the air was palpable, each biker on edge, ready for anything. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, faint cry, a muffled sound that came from behind a pile of discarded metal crates. Without thinking, Jack rushed toward the sound, his boots thudding heavily against the concrete floor. As he reached the crates, he pulled them aside, revealing a small, trembling boy curled up on the ground. "Jamal," Jack whispered, kneeling beside him. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw Jack, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "You came," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Jack reached out, gently lifting him into his arms. The boy was weak, covered in bruises and dirt, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Jack turned to the rest of the group, his voice tight with emotion. "Let's get him out of here." But just as they began to move, a loud crash echoed through the chamber. The sound of footsteps approaching, quick and heavy. Jack's heart raced. They weren't alone. The door to the chamber slammed shut with a deafening noise. The bikers immediately sprang into action, positioning themselves in front of Jack and the boy, preparing for whatever was coming next. "Get ready," Jack said, his voice cold with determination. He wasn't leaving without the girl's brother, no matter who showed up. And if they were going to make it out of here alive, they were going to fight for it. The tension in the air was palpable. Jack held Jamal close to him, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the room, looking for any sign of movement. The bikers had formed a tight circle around the boy, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every muscle in their bodies tense and ready for action. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft drip of water echoing in the cavernous chamber. The door had just slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside with whatever threat was lurking. Jack's mind raced. They had come for one reason, to rescue this boy. But now, it was clear they were dealing with something much larger than just a kidnapping. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for justice. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Jack turned to his crew, his voice low but sharp. "Stay alert. Don't let your guard down." The bikers nodded, their hands instinctively reaching for the weapons they carried. These weren't just ordinary bikers. These were warriors, hardened by the road and battle-tested in ways most people could never imagine. They had fought in wars, stood up to the law when the system failed, and fought for the kind of people society often overlooked. And now, they would fight to protect this boy. The door to the chamber creaked open again, and a figure stepped into the dim light. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask. His eyes were cold, calculating. He looked at Jack and the bikers without a hint of fear. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice steady, but the threat in it was clear. Jack didn't flinch. "We're not leaving without the kid," he replied, his tone firm. "You're going to have to kill us to stop us." The man's lips twitched into a cruel smile. "I don't plan to kill anyone," he said, pulling out a small device from his pocket. He pressed a button, and suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. The bikers froze, every sense on high alert. The air seemed to thicken with danger. They could hear the faint sound of machinery running somewhere in the background, a low hum that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Jack's hand tightened around the grip of his gun as he scanned the room. He could hear the man's footsteps, but they were coming from every direction. This wasn't just a fight. They were walking straight into a trap. "Move!" Jack barked. The bikers scattered, their movements swift and coordinated. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, but Jack's eyes slowly adjusted, allowing him to make out shapes and shadows. The sound of heavy breathing, the shuffle of feet. He knew they had to move fast. They couldn't let this place turn into a killing ground. He turned to one of the bikers, a big guy named Diesel, who had a reputation for being unshakable in the heat of battle. "Get to the kid. Make sure he's okay." Diesel nodded and moved toward Jamal, staying low and using the shadows for cover. Jack's eyes flicked to the rest of his crew, making sure they were staying in formation. They needed to protect the boy, but they also had to find a way out. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, the walls seeming to close in as they waited for their next move. The man in black was still out there somewhere, but Jack could feel something else moving in the shadows. They weren't alone. From the corner of his eye, Jack saw a flash of movement, a figure darting across the room, too quick for him to make out. "Stay sharp," Jack yelled, and without warning, the figure lunged at them, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The room exploded into chaos. Bikers scrambled to fight back, the sounds of fists hitting flesh, boots connecting with bodies, filling the chamber. Jack fired his gun, the sound echoing in the narrow space. His shot hit its target, but the figure didn't fall. Instead, it staggered back, revealing more of its form. It was another man, dressed in the same black gear, his face covered with a similar mask. But this time, there was something different. The man wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them from all sides. It was a trap, a coordinated ambush. Jack gritted his teeth. There was no turning back now. "Get out of here now," he shouted, but his words were drowned out by the sounds of gunfire and fists flying. The bikers fought with everything they had, but the odds were stacked against them. They had come to rescue one life, but now they were fighting for their own. Diesel had reached Jamal, but the boy was still too weak to move on his own. Jack knew they had to make a choice. They could fight their way out or risk losing everything. The fight was far from over, but Jack knew one thing for certain. They weren't leaving this place without Jamal. The chaos erupted around them as the room seemed to close in. Jack's heart raced, his thoughts moving faster than his feet as he fought to maintain control. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and blood and the sound of fists pounding against bodies mixed with the crackling noise of gunfire. The bikers were outnumbered, but they weren't backing down. Jack ducked to the side as a masked man lunged toward him, his knife gleaming in the dim light. Jack sidestepped, feeling the rush of adrenaline as he grabbed the man's arm and twisted it, sending the knife skittering across the floor. Without hesitation, he delivered a punch that knocked the man back, his head slamming against the concrete. Jack didn't have time to think. His focus was on the boy. Diesel was doing his best to shield Jamal, but the kid was too weak, too scared. Jack looked over his shoulder. "Get him out of here now," he shouted. Diesel nodded, his face grim. With one last glance at Jack, he picked up Jamal, cradling him in his massive arms. "We're not leaving without you," Diesel promised, his voice low and steady, but his eyes filled with determination. Jack didn't have time to argue. He watched as Diesel moved toward the stairs, his every step heavy with purpose. But before he could turn to follow, another figure emerged from the shadows, blocking the path. This one was bigger, broader, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a giant among men, and he was armed. "You're not going anywhere," the man growled, his voice like gravel. Jack clenched his jaw. "Move," he said, his voice cold. The man didn't budge. He raised a weapon, a long, gleaming pipe, ready to strike. Without hesitation, Jack swung his fist, catching the man in the jaw. The impact was like a sledgehammer, but the man didn't fall. Instead, he grinned, his teeth bared. "You think that's enough to stop me?" the man sneered. Jack didn't waste time with words. He was fighting for something bigger now. For the kid. For the promise he made. He ducked under the man's swing, narrowly avoiding the pipe. In a blur of movement, Jack twisted the man's arm, sending the pipe flying across the room. The man stumbled back, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. He lunged again, faster this time, but Jack was ready. With a grunt, he threw a punch to the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him. The man staggered, and Jack wasted no time. He grabbed the man's collar and slammed him into the wall. The force of the impact sent a shock wave through the room, knocking several crates over. Jack stood over the man, breathing heavily. "This ends now," he said. The man, groaning, looked up at him, his eyes filled with rage and disbelief. But Jack didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he pulled the man's arm behind his back and pinned him to the floor. "Stay down," Jack ordered. The man struggled, but Jack's grip was ironclad. With the threat neutralized, Jack turned back to Diesel, who was still making his way toward the stairs, Jamal safe in his arms. Jack took a moment to catch his breath before he followed, his feet heavy with the weight of the situation. As he climbed the stairs, the sounds of fighting behind him faded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. The Foundry was still full of shadows, full of threats. The moment they stepped outside, Jack's eyes darted to the dark horizon. The world outside felt cold and empty, a stark contrast to the battle they had just endured. But their job wasn't done. Not yet. Diesel reached the top of the stairs, looking back at Jack. "We need to move faster," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm not sure how long we've got before more of them show up." Jack nodded. The air outside was thick with the smell of exhaust as the bikers revved their engines, preparing for the next phase of their escape. But as Jack looked back at the Foundry, a chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. He turned to Diesel, his voice low. "Something's coming. We need to move, and we need to move now." Diesel didn't question him. He turned to the others, his voice commanding. "Get to the bikes. We're leaving now." Jack felt the weight of the boy in his arms as Diesel helped him onto one of the bikes. Jamal's eyes were barely open, his body weak from the ordeal. Jack's heart ached for him. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a fight for survival. As the bikers revved their engines and began to move, Jack's mind raced. They had escaped the chamber, but what lay ahead? Were they truly safe, or was this just the beginning of something much darker? The night air whipped against his face as he gunned the engine, pushing the bike forward, determined to outrun whatever followed them. But in the back of his mind, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The roar of the motorcycles filled the air as Jack and his crew tore down the highway, the sound of their engines a sharp contrast to the silence of the night around them. The Foundry, now behind them, seemed like a nightmare fading into the distance, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking in the shadows. Jamal was unconscious, his small body resting in Diesel's arms, but the boy had survived, and that was the only thing that mattered now. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his mind racing with questions. Who were these people? What did they want with Jamal? And why had they targeted a child in the first place? The further they rode, the more Jack felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The streetlights blurred past them as they sped toward the outskirts of town, but Jack knew they couldn't stop yet. Not until they were certain they were safe. The wind howled in his ears, but the silence between them was deafening. Diesel's voice broke through the tension. "We need to get off the road," he said, his tone low. "We can't keep running forever. We need a place to lay low, somewhere no one can find us." Jack nodded, his mind already working on a plan. There was an old safe house on the edge of town, a place they had used in the past when things got too hot. It was off the grid, hidden from prying eyes. It was their best shot. "Take the next left," Jack ordered. Diesel's bike veered off the main road, and the others followed in formation, their engines purring as they navigated the winding back roads. The safe house was just a few miles away, but as they approached, Jack's instincts told him something was wrong. The area was too quiet, too still. "Stay sharp," he muttered to the others. They pulled up to the small, run-down cabin nestled in the woods. It looked abandoned, just like the last time they had used it. Jack dismounted his bike, his boots hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. He turned to Diesel, his voice tight with urgency. Get Jamal inside. Keep him safe. Diesel nodded and moved quickly, lifting the boy with ease and carrying him into the cabin. Jack followed, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. As they entered the cabin, the dim light from the single lamp hanging overhead illuminated the room. It was sparse, just a few old couches and a worn coffee table. Jack locked the door behind them, his eyes never leaving the boy. Diesel laid Jamal down on the couch, his hands still shaking from the tension of the night. Jack stood over him, his jaw clenched. He's going to be all right, Diesel said, trying to reassure him. We got him out. That's what matters. But Jack wasn't convinced. He knew they had just scratched the surface of something much bigger, something that was watching them from the shadows. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. This isn't over, Jack muttered. We've got a target on our backs now. Diesel looked at him, his eyes hard. So what's next? We keep running. Jack shook his head. No, we fight. The room was still, the weight of their decision hanging in the air. Jack turned to the others, who had gathered around the cabin, their faces set with determination. We go back. We take the fight to them. The bikers nodded, their resolve clear. They had come for Jamal, and they weren't leaving without answers. As the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of wind in the trees, had him on edge. He knew they couldn't stay here for long. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. As the others prepared for what was coming, Jack stepped outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world around him was quiet, but he felt the storm brewing in his chest. He had promised Tyrone he would protect his daughter, and he wasn't about to break that promise. He would fight for Jamal, for his family, no matter what it took. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The tension in the cabin was unbearable as the group gathered, their faces hard, set with the weight of what lay ahead. Jack stood by the window, staring out into the dense woods, his thoughts racing. He could still hear the sounds of the battle back at the Foundry, the gunshots, the shouts, and the violence that had unfolded just hours ago. Now, they were holed up in this small cabin, trying to catch their breath, but Jack knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Diesel paced back and forth, his heavy boots creaking against the floorboards. We can't just sit here, he said, his voice low but filled with urgency. We need a plan. If they want to fight, we give them one. But we need to know who we're up against. Jack turned, meeting Diesel's eyes. We don't know enough yet. But we're going back to the Foundry. We're getting answers. Diesel shook his head. That place is crawling with them. We don't know how many people are behind this, Jack. It's not just a couple of guys. We've stirred up something much bigger. Jack didn't flinch. I don't care how many they are. We've already lost too much. I'm not backing down. The rest of the crew nodded in agreement. They knew Jack was right. This wasn't just about saving Jamal anymore. It was about standing up to whatever was pulling the strings behind the scenes. We'll go in small, Jack continued. We'll scope it out first. We don't rush in blind. Agreed, Diesel said. But we're not going alone. Jack turned to him, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Diesel grinned, a glint of mischief in his eyes. You think we're the only ones who've got a score to settle? With a deep growl, Diesel pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Jack raised an eyebrow, watching as Diesel stepped into the corner of the cabin. The rest of the crew remained quiet, exchanging wary glances. Jack's eyes never left Diesel, his mind already working through the possibilities. Who could Diesel be calling? A few moments passed before Diesel turned back, holding up his phone with a smirk. We've got backup, he said. A few friends who owe us. Jack's eyes narrowed. Who? Diesel didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned to the door. You'll see soon enough. Moments later, a familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air, growing louder as they approached. The sound sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He knew that sound. It was unmistakable. The Thunderwolves MC, a crew that had helped them out of tight spots more than once. They had a reputation for getting things done, no matter the cost. The door creaked open, and a few men in leather jackets stepped inside. They were big, with tattoos covering every inch of their arms, faces set with grim determination. Their leader, a man named Crow, stepped forward. We heard you were in trouble, Crow said, his deep voice filling the cabin. We're here to help. Jack nodded, meeting Crow's eyes. "You've got a fight on your hands," he said. Crow cracked a grin. "We've had worse. Where do we start?" The plan was simple. They would return to the Foundry, but they wouldn't go in unprepared. Jack and Diesel would lead the way, with Crow and the Thunderwolves following behind, ready for anything. They would recon the area first, find out who was behind all of this, and if necessary, make their move. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all they had. The group geared up quickly, pulling on their leather jackets and checking their weapons. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a raid, it was personal. As they mounted their bikes and revved the engines, Jack felt the weight of the situation settle over him. The Foundry loomed ahead, just a few miles away, but in Jack's mind, it felt like an eternity. The night was heavy with anticipation, the darkness seeming to stretch on forever. They rode in formation, the engines roaring through the night, cutting through the cold air like a freight train. As they neared the Foundry, the lights of the building flickered in the distance. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars. They were getting closer. The plan was still simple. No rush, no chaos. Just gather information, find the people behind this, and get out. But Jack could feel it. There was more to this than just a simple kidnapping. This was about power, control, and something much bigger than any of them realized. As they pulled up to the Foundry's gates, Jack's gut clenched. This was it. They were going in. The group dismounted, moving quietly, the sound of their boots muffled by the damp ground. Jack led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The Foundry was still as eerie as ever, the broken windows and rusted gates a testament to years of abandonment. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, they weren't just trespassers. They were here to reclaim something that had been stolen. And Jack wasn't leaving until he got answers. The Foundry loomed before them, dark and imposing, its broken windows casting faint, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. Jack's senses were on high alert as the group moved quietly, their boots barely making a sound on the cold ground. The night had swallowed them whole, leaving only the low hum of the wind and the distant thrum of their motorcycles. Jack felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. They had come here for answers, but with every step, the danger seemed to grow more real. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Diesel was right behind him, the Thunderwolves MC flanking them in a tight formation, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Jack's hand rested on the grip of his gun, his fingers itching to draw it at the slightest provocation. He wasn't sure what to expect inside, but he knew one thing for certain. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They reached the main entrance, a rusted, iron gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Jack motioned for the group to stop. He crouched down, studying the ground, his eyes tracing the tracks left behind. "Someone's been here recently," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Diesel nodded, his face grim. "That means we're not alone." Jack motioned for them to move forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of their boots against the concrete echoed through the silence as they pushed open the gate. It creaked loudly, sending a jolt of alarm through Jack's system. He winced, but there was no turning back now. They slipped inside, the air inside the Foundry cold and stale, smelling of rust and decay. The vast space stretched out before them, empty and silent, but Jack knew better than to trust the quiet. The shadows were thick, hiding things, and every creak of the building made his nerves tighten. "Stay close," Jack whispered. "We don't know what's waiting for us." They moved in a single file, each biker aware of their surroundings, their eyes darting to every corner, every dark alcove. They made their way deeper into the Foundry, the faint sound of dripping water filling the space. The walls around them were cracked and crumbling, the machinery long forgotten, overtaken by rust and time. But there was something else now, something that made Jack's stomach twist. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "We're close," he said, his voice steady. Diesel looked around, his brow furrowed. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." They paused, listening. There was a low, distant sound, footsteps, maybe, or something heavier, something more sinister. Jack raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. The sound grew louder, closer. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was a man, but he wasn't alone. A group of men stepped out from behind the crumbling walls, their eyes cold, calculating. They were armed. "You should have stayed away," the man said, his voice deep and harsh. Jack's grip on his gun tightened. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Let the kid go, and nobody gets hurt." The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was the smile of someone who had already decided their fate. "You're too late," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "We already have what we need." Jack's blood ran cold. "Where's the boy?" he demanded. "What have you done to him?" The man's smile widened. "Oh, he's safe. For now. But you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Jack didn't waste any more time with words. With a sharp motion, he drew his gun, aiming it directly at the man. The tension in the room was unbearable. The bikers behind him followed suit, weapons drawn, ready for whatever came next. "Get ready," Jack muttered under his breath. "This isn't going to be easy." Without warning, the man lunged forward, drawing a gun of his own. The sound of gunfire rang through the foundry, echoing off the walls, deafening in the silence that had settled around them. Jack ducked behind a stack of crates, narrowly avoiding the blast. The bikers spread out, taking cover wherever they could find it. The firefight had begun. Jack's heart raced as he peeked out from behind his cover, his eyes locking onto the group of men advancing toward them. The room was alive with the chaos of battle, the sound of bullets flying, the sharp crack of gunshots, and the distant sound of something metal scraping across the floor. Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to lose focus. The boy's life was at stake. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rescuing Jamal and putting an end to whatever dark scheme these men had been running. He couldn't let them get away. Not this time. "We take them down now," Jack shouted. No mercy. The bikers charged, their weapons raised, moving in perfect coordination. The sound of boots hitting the concrete was drowned out by the gunfire, but Jack's mind was clear. This was the moment they had been waiting for. There was no turning back now. The gunfire echoed through the foundry as Jack and his crew fought tooth and nail against the men who had taken Jamal. The air was thick with tension, the sound of bullets zipping by and the staccato of automatic weapons reverberating in every corner. Jack's pulse raced, his body moving on autopilot as he fired back, the heat of the battle fueling his every move. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking down these bastards and getting Jamal back. Behind him, Diesel moved like a shadow, his massive frame ducking and weaving, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Crow and the Thunderwolves were holding their own, their guns roaring as they provided cover for Jack and the others. "Keep it tight," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We push forward, no retreat." The bikers followed his command without hesitation, moving as one, the sound of their boots thudding against the concrete floor as they advanced. The enemies in front of them were dug in, but they weren't prepared for the onslaught that Jack and his crew brought. As they closed the gap, a few more men appeared, emerging from behind the rusted machinery, guns blazing. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and took down the nearest man with a single shot. The rest of the crew followed suit, picking off their targets one by one. The firefight was intense, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sharp tang of blood. Jack's focus was unwavering, his mind sharp as he kept moving, covering his crew and pushing toward the heart of the foundry. They had to get to Jamal. They had to finish this. But as they pressed forward, the sound of more footsteps echoed from behind them. Jack turned, his heart sinking as a new wave of men, larger and more heavily armed, flooded into the foundry. "Damn it," Jack cursed, realizing they were surrounded. Diesel's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We need to move. Now. We're not going to last long if we stay here." Jack's mind raced. They couldn't fight their way out, not with Jamal still in their hands. He glanced around, looking for an exit, a way out. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A small staircase leading up to a catwalk, a way to get above the fray. "Head for the stairs," Jack yelled, pushing forward. The bikers turned, racing toward the staircase as gunfire erupted around them. Jack and Diesel covered the rear, keeping their eyes on the advancing enemy. With every step, they moved closer to their goal. The staircase creaked under their weight as they ascended, the sound of heavy footsteps following them from below. Jack's heart raced as he reached the top, pulling Diesel and the others up behind him. The catwalk stretched out ahead of them, narrow and precarious. Stay low, stay quiet, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, the sound of the firefight below growing fainter as they made their way deeper into the foundry. The catwalk led them to a large open room, filled with old equipment and piles of rusted metal. Jack motioned for the others to stop, his eyes scanning the area. There was no sign of Jamal, but something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he motioned for the group to fan out. It was then that he saw it. A door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar. Jack's instincts kicked in. That's where they're keeping him, he said, his voice low. They moved toward the door, silent as ghosts, every step calculated. As they reached it, Jack carefully pushed it open, his gun raised. Inside, they found a room filled with old crates and boxes. And there, in the corner, lying on the cold concrete floor, was Jamal. Jack's heart stopped for a moment as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the boy. Jamal, he whispered, his voice breaking. The boy was bruised, his clothes torn, but he was alive. Jack let out a sigh of relief, brushing the boy's hair out of his face. Jamal stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Jack, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Jack smiled, relief flooding through him. You're safe now, kid, he said, lifting him into his arms. Diesel and the others watched, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and relief. They had done it. They had rescued Jamal. But their work wasn't over. The foundry was still crawling with enemies, and Jack knew they weren't done yet. As he stood up, cradling Jamal in his arms, he looked at Diesel. Get him out of here, Jack said. Diesel nodded, already moving toward the exit. Jack turned, his eyes scanning the room. The rest of you, we finished this. We're not leaving until we've taken down every last one of them. The bikers nodded, ready for the next fight. They had come for Jamal, and they weren't leaving without justice. Jack's grip tightened on his gun as he moved toward the exit, the sound of gunfire still ringing in his ears. He wasn't going to stop, not until the job was done. The foundry was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and decaying walls, but Jack's focus was sharp. He had Jamal safely in Diesel's arms, but the battle wasn't over. The firefight had subsided, but the danger was far from gone. As they moved through the foundry, the shadows seemed to move with them, the echoes of their footsteps bouncing off the metal walls. Jack's heart was still racing, his thoughts racing even faster. They had come for Jamal, and now they had him. But they weren't leaving until every last one of those men who had taken him was brought to justice. We've got to end this, Jack muttered, his voice low and steady. Diesel, still carrying the boy, nodded. We're close. We just need to get out of here. But Jack knew better than to believe it would be that easy. The foundry was a trap, and they had walked right into it. Even now, he could hear the faint sound of movement in the distance, the low hum of footsteps and the scrape of metal against concrete. They were being hunted. We're not leaving without finishing this, Jack said firmly, turning to the others. Crow and the Thunder Wolves were still by his side, weapons drawn, their faces grim but resolute. They had seen the worst, and they knew that this wasn't over. They could hear it in the way the silence seemed to settle around them, the calm before the storm. As they moved forward, the tension in the air grew thicker. Jack could feel his senses heighten, every step calculated, every movement deliberate. The foundry, once a place of industry, had become a war zone, and they were the ones who were going to take it back. We need to find the leader, Jack said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. The one pulling the strings. He's the one we need. Diesel, still carrying Jamal, grunted in agreement. We find him, we end this. They pushed forward, navigating through the maze of old equipment and decaying machinery. The sound of their boots on the concrete was the only thing that cut through the eerie silence. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it was leading them deeper into the trap. But Jack wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. As they moved deeper into the heart of the foundry, Jack could feel the eyes of their enemies on them. They were being watched. He could almost hear the sinister whispers that had been following them since they first set foot in this place. And then, suddenly, the stillness was shattered by the sound of a voice. You really think you're going to walk out of here alive? The voice was cold, mocking, and filled with malice. Jack froze, his hand tightening on his gun. The others did the same, spreading out, forming a defensive circle. The voice came again, closer this time. I admire your courage, but you're all just pawns in a game you don't understand. Jack's blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. It was him, the leader, the one who had orchestrated everything. He had been watching them the entire time. Show yourself, Jack growled, his voice low and steady. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and imposing, dressed in dark tactical gear. His face was obscured by a mask, but his eyes gleamed with cold determination. I've been waiting for this moment, the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. You've caused a lot of trouble for me, Jack. But this ends tonight. Jack's grip on his gun tightened. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body ready for whatever was coming next. This ends when we say it does, Jack shot back, his voice unwavering. The man's smile was cold and cruel. We'll see about that. Without warning, he lunged forward, drawing a gun from his side. The sound of gunfire filled the air, and Jack dove for cover, narrowly avoiding the first barrage of shots. Move, Jack shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The bikers scattered, taking cover behind the nearest crates and machinery. The firefight erupted once again, the air thick with the sound of gunfire. Jack could feel the heat of the battle, but he remained calm, focused. He fired back, his shots finding their targets with deadly accuracy. The leader wasn't alone. His men emerged from the shadows, joining the fight. Jack gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he continued to fire, his thoughts never leaving Jamal. They couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. As the battle raged on, Jack's mind flashed back to the promise he had made to Tyrone, to protect Jamal, no matter the cost. He had kept that promise so far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He had come too far to fail. The gunfire grew louder, the clash of steel against steel ringing in his ears. He was so close to the leader, so close to ending this. With a surge of determination, Jack pushed forward, his gun raised, his eyes locked on the man who had started all of this. It was time to finish this fight. Jack's resolve was stronger than ever as he charged forward, determined to bring an end to the nightmare that had taken Jamal's life and their own. The firefight continued with intense chaos, gunfire ringing in the air as Jack and his crew pressed forward. The leader's men had scattered across the foundry, moving quickly and efficiently, taking up positions behind rusted machinery and walls of crates. The shadows seemed alive, shifting with every movement, making it hard to predict where the next shot would come from. Jack's grip on his gun tightened as his eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of the man who had orchestrated everything. The noise was deafening, the echo of gunshots bouncing off the cold, steel walls, but Jack's focus was sharp. He could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. Jamal was counting on them. They had to end this, once and for all. As Jack advanced, he felt a surge of adrenaline. The leader wasn't just some random thug. This man had been planning this for months, pulling strings from the shadows, manipulating people to get what he wanted. Jack couldn't let him get away. The man had already hurt so many, including the child he had promised to protect. His mind flashed back to the moments when they had first found Jamal, unconscious and bruised, lying on that cold floor. He had made a vow to Tyrone, and he wasn't going to break it now. Diesel moved up beside him, keeping pace as they advanced deeper into the foundry. The firefight was still raging behind them, but Jack had his eyes set on the leader. There was no turning back now. Stay sharp, Jack growled, motioning for Diesel to follow him. They pushed forward, their boots making a sharp sound on the concrete floor as they moved past broken machinery, crates, and rusted pipes. It wasn't long before they reached a small alcove, and there, standing in the shadows, was the man they had been hunting. He was tall, his face hidden behind a mask, but the way he stood, commanding, confident, was unmistakable. He was waiting for them, his hands resting casually on the hilt of a gun at his side. I knew you would come, the man said, his voice low and taunting. Jack's blood boiled. Where is he? Jack demanded, his voice filled with rage. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming from behind the mask. You really think you can stop this? You're just a few men with guns. You think you can take me down? Jack's jaw tightened. You've hurt enough people. It ends tonight. Without another word, Jack moved, his body flowing into action. The man drew his gun, but Jack was faster. In one swift motion, he dove behind a metal crate, narrowly avoiding the incoming shots. He fired back, his shots landing with precision, but the man had already moved, disappearing into the shadows once again. "We need to flank him," Diesel said, his voice steady. "We're not letting him get away." Jack nodded, motioning for the others to spread out. The Thunderwolves MC moved into position, their eyes sharp and alert. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline rushing through him. The stakes were higher than ever now. This was no longer just about rescuing a child. It was about bringing justice to the people who had been terrorized for far too long. The man's voice echoed through the Foundry, mocking them from every corner. "You can't win. You'll never win. This place is mine. You're just out of your depth." Jack's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. With a sudden burst of speed, Jack rushed forward, his gun raised, but the man was gone again. They were playing cat and mouse, and Jack wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this up. His eyes scanned the room once more, looking for any sign of movement. Then, he saw it. Through a crack in the wall, a faint outline of the man moving, slipping through the shadows. Without hesitation, Jack sprinted toward it, his body moving like a machine, every muscle primed for action. "Jack, wait!" Diesel shouted, but Jack didn't stop. This was it. He could feel it in his bones. He was getting closer. The man was cornered. As Jack reached the corner of the Foundry, he turned, gun in hand, prepared to face the leader once and for all. But just as he stepped into the open, the sound of a gunshot rang out. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he felt the sharp sting of pain in his side. He gasped, but his body didn't falter. He spun around to find the source of the shot. Standing at the far end of the room was the man, his gun still smoking. "You're not leaving here alive," the man said, his voice colder than ever. Jack gritted his teeth, his hand pressing against his wound as he fought to stay upright. The pain was intense, but his resolve was stronger. He wasn't going to die here, not when he was so close to finishing this. With every ounce of strength, Jack pushed forward, his gun raised and aimed. This was the moment, the final confrontation. He wasn't going to let this man win, not after everything they had been through. Jack steadied his aim and fired, his bullet hitting its target with deadly precision. The man's body jerked back, his weapon falling to the ground. He collapsed to the floor, a final, defeated look in his eyes. The fight was over. Jack stood there, breathing heavily, his body screaming in pain, but he had won. He had kept his promise. Diesel rushed to his side, his eyes scanning Jack's wound. "You good?" he asked, his voice tense. Jack nodded, though the pain was overwhelming. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "Let's get out of here." With that, the bikers gathered, making their way out of the Foundry, Jamal safe in their arms. The battle was over, but the war had left its mark on all of them. As they rode out into the night, Jack's mind was still racing, but there was a sense of relief. They had done it, and they weren't stopping now. The sound of the motorcycles roared through the night as Jack, Diesel, and the rest of the crew made their way out of the Foundry. The battle was over, but the tension was still heavy in the air. Jamal, now safe and resting in Diesel's arms, had been through hell, and so had the bikers. Jack's mind was racing, still processing the chaos they had just survived. They had fought their way through a deadly trap, taken down a dangerous enemy, and rescued a child who had been caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than any of them had imagined. But despite their victory, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. The man they had taken down, the leader, had been only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The entire situation, the hidden motives behind the kidnapping, the shadowy figures that had been pulling the strings, it all pointed to something more than just a simple rescue mission. And Jack knew it wasn't over. Not yet. As they rode through the darkened roads, the cool night air whipped against their faces, but the relief Jack had hoped to feel never came. They were too close to the fire now, and the heat still lingered. He stole a glance at Diesel, who was still holding Jamal tightly. Diesel's face was a mask of exhaustion, but there was something else there too, determination. Jack knew his friend had the same feeling gnawing at him. This wasn't just about saving one boy anymore. It was about making sure the rest of them, everyone, stayed safe from whatever had been lurking in the shadows. They had won tonight, but Jack couldn't shake the thought that the enemy they had just fought was only a small part of something much larger, something they had yet to fully uncover. The Thunderwolves MC had joined them in their battle, and now they were on their way back to their base. As the sound of their motorcycles faded into the night, Jack's thoughts turned to the future. He had promised Tyrone that he would protect Jamal, but the reality was, keeping that promise might be harder than he'd expected. The ride felt like it took forever, but finally, the crew reached the safety of their base, the familiar sight of their campgrounds welcoming them. The atmosphere was different now. There was no celebration, no victory cheers. The crew dismounted, the mood solemn, and they all gathered in a tight circle. Jamal, still unconscious, was carefully set down on one of the benches, and Diesel crouched beside him, keeping a protective eye on the boy. Jack stood nearby, his arms crossed, his mind still churning. "We made it out," Diesel finally spoke, his voice heavy with fatigue. "But we all know this isn't over." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "We need to find out who else is involved in this, and why they targeted Jamal." The group remained silent for a moment, the gravity of their situation sinking in. Jack could feel the weight of their eyes on him, waiting for him to say something, to give them a direction. He finally spoke, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "We've taken down the leader, but there's more to this. We need answers, and we need to make sure nothing like this happens again. If we don't find out who's pulling the strings, we're just going to end up back where we started." Diesel stood up, nodding. "We'll keep our ears to the ground. The people we've just fought won't stay quiet for long. They'll be looking for us, trying to finish what they started." Jack turned toward the campfire, watching the flames flicker in the dark. He knew Diesel was right. It wasn't over yet, but they had taken the first step. They had rescued Jamal, and that was a victory in itself. They just had to make sure they didn't let their guard down now. He looked back at the others, his voice firm. "We'll stay here tonight. Regroup. Rest. But tomorrow, we hit the ground running. We find out everything we can about these people. And when we do, we make them pay." The bikers around him nodded in agreement. They were a team, and they would finish this together. Jack glanced back at Diesel, who was still sitting beside Jamal, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder protectively. "We keep moving forward," Jack said. Diesel met his gaze, and for the first time in hours, Jack saw the faintest flicker of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were in this together. They had come through the worst of it. Now, they just had to make sure they stayed one step ahead. The night stretched on, and Jack allowed himself a moment to relax, the quiet of the camp surrounding him. But in the back of his mind, he knew this was just the calm before the storm. There was more to come, and when it did, they would be ready. The morning light broke through the trees as the crew sat around the campfire, their faces tired but resolute. The night had been long, filled with whispered conversations and the weight of the battles they had fought. Jamal had finally woken up, though he still looked exhausted, his eyes scanning the faces around him with a mix of confusion and fear. Diesel sat by his side, offering what comfort he could. Jack watched from a distance, his mind still on the mission ahead. The leader was gone, but Jack knew the others were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The Foundry was just one part of the operation, and Jack wasn't naive enough to think taking down the leader was the end. They still had questions, and those questions were gnawing at him. Who else was involved? What was their ultimate plan? And why had Jamal been their target in the first place? Jack knew he wouldn't get any answers just by sitting here, waiting. He had to take the fight to them. The bikers had regrouped, but the sense of calm they had hoped for was shattered by the looming threat that still hung over them. The campfire crackled as Jack stood up, his boots crunching on the dirt beneath him. Diesel looked up from Jamal, his eyes tired but understanding. "What's the next move?" Diesel asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Jack glanced over at the crew, who were all looking to him for direction. "We go after them," Jack said, his voice firm. "We don't sit around waiting for them to make the next move. We go back to the city, talk to anyone who might know something, and we start digging into their operation." Diesel stood up, his face dark with determination. "And if we find them, what then?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Then we take them down. We finish what we started." The rest of the crew stood up, their faces set with the same grim determination. They were ready for whatever came next. They had been through the worst of it and come out on top. Now it was time to make sure that Jamal would be safe and that whoever was behind this wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. As they loaded up their bikes and prepared to leave, Jack's thoughts went back to the night before. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. The damage had already been done, and they still didn't have all the answers. The sound of the engines revving filled the air as they rode out, the road stretching out before them. It was a long ride back to the city, and Jack knew they had a lot of work ahead of them. They couldn't afford to be complacent. As they neared the city, Jack's mind raced with ideas, with plans for the next step. They needed to gather information, dig deeper into the web of corruption and deceit that had led them to this point. He wasn't sure who they could trust, but he knew they couldn't do this alone. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Jack muttered to himself. Diesel, riding beside him, heard the words. "You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" Diesel asked, his voice low. Jack nodded, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "We need help. People who can get us answers. People with resources." Diesel glanced over, his face thoughtful. "I know a guy. A private investigator. He's got connections, and he's been around long enough to know how to get things done." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You trust him?" Diesel gave a small nod. "He's reliable. I've worked with him before." Jack thought for a moment. "All right, let's make the call. We're going to need all the help we can get to track down these people." They pulled into the parking lot of a small diner just outside the city. It was a quiet place, far enough from the chaos of the city to give them some breathing room. Diesel got off his bike first, making his way to the payphone outside the diner. Jack stayed by the bikes, keeping an eye on the surroundings. Diesel returned a few minutes later, a small grin on his face. "He'll meet us tonight. Says he's got some leads for us." Jack nodded. "Good. Let's rest for a bit. We'll head out tonight. We've got work to do." The hours passed slowly as they rested, ate, and recharged. Jack found himself staring out the window, his mind racing. They were getting closer, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. He could feel the danger lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to slip up. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. As night fell, the crew gathered their things, mounted their bikes, and revved their engines. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was ready. They were going to finish this, and they weren't going to stop until they had all the answers. They rode off into the night, the city skyline looming ahead, and Jack felt the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone pressing down on him. He wasn't going to let anyone else suffer because of these people. He would see this through to the end. The night was thick with tension as Jack and the crew approached the small warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Diesel had made the call to the private investigator, and now they were about to meet him. The ride had been long, but Jack's mind was sharp. There were so many unanswered questions, but tonight, they would finally get the answers they'd been hunting for. Jamal had fallen asleep in the back of Diesel's bike, exhausted from everything that had happened, but Jack couldn't rest. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. Who was really behind all this? The man they had taken down in the Foundry was just one cog in a much larger machine. Jack wasn't going to stop until he pulled that machine apart. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and uninviting. As they dismounted their bikes, the crew stayed close, weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning every corner of the area. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a potential trap, and Jack wasn't going to let his guard down. Diesel walked up to the side door of the warehouse, giving Jack a nod before he opened it. The small group slipped inside, their footsteps muffled on the cold concrete floor. The place was deserted, save for a single light hanging from the ceiling. A man stood beneath it, his face partially obscured by shadows. He was tall, with a lean build, and wore a dark jacket that blended with the gloom. His eyes were sharp, alert. "You must be the bikers," he said, his voice low but calm. "You don't look like the type to ask for help, but I assume you have a good reason for seeking me out." Jack stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the man. "We need answers," Jack said, his voice steady but full of intent. "About the people behind the Foundry, the ones who've been kidnapping kids. We need to know who's pulling the strings, and we need to know now." The man nodded slowly, then glanced over at Diesel, who had his arms crossed, watching him closely. "I know more than you think," the man said, his voice now carrying an air of authority. "I've been tracking them for months. They're not just random thugs. This goes deeper than you realize. These people, they're connected to some very powerful organizations. The Foundry, the kidnappings, it's all part of a much bigger operation. And it's not just happening here." Jack's heart raced. "What are you saying? Who's behind it?" The man paused, then took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "I'm saying it's bigger than you can imagine. These people have connections in high places. I'm talking about politicians, businessmen, law enforcement, even military. The children they've been taking are just the start. They're being used for something much darker, something much more dangerous. And as much as you want to end it, You're up against an enemy that's not just going to let you walk away from this. Jack's stomach twisted as he took in the man's words. He had known they were up against something big, but hearing it confirmed made it all feel even more real and far more terrifying. The man continued. There's a facility they've been using, a place where they hold these kids, do God knows what to them. It's not far from here, but getting in won't be easy. They're heavily guarded, and if you're not careful, they'll take you down just like they've done to anyone who's tried to stop them. Jack didn't hesitate. Then we take them down first. Diesel stepped forward, his expression serious. You said you've been tracking them. You've got the intel we need. The man gave a grim nod. I've got the coordinates. I've been watching them for weeks. I know exactly where they're keeping the kids. But you need to understand, once you go in, there's no turning back. This is a war now, and you're going to need more than just guns and motorcycles to fight it. You're going to need allies. People who can help you take down this operation for good. Jack's eyes narrowed, his mind calculating their next move. He wasn't backing down. Not now. We've got allies, Jack said, his voice full of resolve. And we'll make sure this ends. For good. The man handed Diesel a small piece of paper with the coordinates. You're going to need a plan, and you're going to need everything you've got. But if you're going in, you'd better be ready to fight for your lives. This isn't just a mission. It's a full-on battle. Jack took the paper, his fingers tightening around it. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He had come too far, done too much, to let this go. The bikers had already risked everything to rescue Jamal, and now they were about to take on a full-blown criminal operation. But Jack wasn't worried. He had his crew, his family, and that was all he needed. The man stepped back into the shadows as Jack turned to Diesel, his expression resolute. We ride at dawn, Jack said. Diesel nodded, and the rest of the crew gathered around, ready for whatever came next. The fight was just beginning, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They would see this through, no matter the cost. In this thrilling chapter of Hell Angel's stories, Jack and his crew face a dangerous battle after rescuing Jamal from a sinister operation. With the leader of the operation down, they know their fight is far from over. The darkness surrounding the criminal network becomes clearer, and Jack vows to finish what they started. As the crew tracks down the mastermind behind the kidnapping, they uncover chilling secrets that lead them to a dangerous facility, guarded and heavily protected. With each step, the tension rises in this Hell Angel's story, where the stakes are higher than ever. The team prepares for a final confrontation, knowing that they're up against an organization with far-reaching power. As they gear up for the next phase of their mission, the line between justice and revenge becomes increasingly blurred. This Hell Angel's story will keep you on the edge of your seat as Jack and his crew dive deeper into the darkness, determined to bring justice and protect the innocent. As the final battle looms, they must rely on their strength and unity to overcome the powerful enemies standing in their way. This Hell Angel story proves that no matter how high the stakes, the fight for survival and justice never stops.